I have a folder on my laptop called Paradise. Inside it are 3 years of research, photographs of houses I saved from property listings, screenshots of beach views, spreadsheets comparing the cost of living in different Philippine cities, articles about expat communities, notes from forums where retired Britons discuss their experiences of relocating to Southeast Asia. I built that folder the way an architect builds a project file. Methodically, lovingly, with the specific care of a man who has spent 40 years designing spaces for other people to live their lives in and who has finally, at the end of a long career, given himself permission to design his own. I have not deleted the folder. I am not sure I will. It is the record of something that was genuinely mine before Rochelle Fernandez got near it, and I am not ready to let go of the version of myself that built it. My name is Orlando Hemmings, 70 years old. I spent my working life as an architect in Bristol residential mostly, some commercial, a 20-year partnership with a man named Jeffrey that ended well when we both decided we had done enough. I was good at my work in the way that a craftsman is good, not brilliantly inspired, not famous, but technically careful and attentive to how people actually lived in spaces rather than how spaces were supposed to be used in theory. When I retired in 2020, I had a flat in Clifton that I owned outright, a reasonable pension, and a project I had been planning in my head for the better part of a decade. Find a property in the Philippines, ideally near the sea, and spend my retirement years in warmth and beauty and the kind of unhurried daily life that Bristol in November does not offer. The Philippines specifically came from a conversation at a conference in 2014 where I had met a retired New Zealand architect named Graham, who had spent 2 years in the Philippines after his own retirement and described it as the place he had felt most at home in his adult life. He talked about the light, about the cost of materials, about the way architecture there had absorbed Spanish colonial influence and adapted it into something genuinely Filipino that was unlike anything else in the region. I was interested from that conversation onward, and over the following years, the interest became research, and the research became a plan, and the plan became the folder on my laptop with the 3 years of careful accumulation inside it. I flew to Manila in January of 2021 for a 6-week exploratory trip. My intention was to spend the first 2 weeks in the city getting my bearings, then travel to several areas that my research had identified as having the combination of beauty, infrastructure, and expat community that I was looking for. I had a list of neighborhoods and towns, some near Cebu, some in Batangas province, one near Dumaguete on Negros Island, and I had arranged viewings through several agents whose contact details I had found through expat forums and property websites. Rochelle Fernandez was not on my original list. She contacted me. I had posted on an expat forum, one of the larger ones, with a property section asking for recommendations for estate agents with experience helping British buyers navigate the Philippine property market. The post attracted several replies, some useful, some generic. Rochelle's message was different. It was specific and detailed and showed she had read my post carefully. She referenced the areas I had mentioned, noted that 2 of them had significant foreign ownership restrictions that I had not been aware of, and explained the alternative structures that were legally available for foreign nationals wishing to hold property in the Philippines. She told me she had worked with 3 other British clients in the previous 2 years and offered references. She said she specialized in helping foreign retirees find not just a property but a home, which is a different thing, and that she understood the difference because she had spent 7 years working in Singapore and had lived the experience of needing to build a life somewhere unfamiliar. I emailed back with a question about the Batangas property specifically, and she answered within 2 hours with a level of detail that satisfied me. We arranged a video call for the following week. She was 41 years old, professional in presentation, and she asked better questions than I had expected. She asked about my architectural background and whether that would make me more or less flexible about condition, whether I could see past a structurally sound property in poor cosmetic condition, or whether I needed something move-in ready. She asked about my tolerance for distance from the city. She asked about whether I was thinking of this as a permanent base or as part of a multi-location retirement. She asked whether I intended to rent out the property at any point, which had legal implications for the ownership structure. These were good questions. The questions of an estate agent who understood that a property search was about a person's life rather than a transaction. I liked her immediately and professionally, which is a distinction I should have maintained more carefully throughout what followed. We met in person in my third week in Manila. She drove me to 4 properties over 2 days in Batangas province, a coastal area south of Manila, with the combination of sea access and reasonable drive time to the city that I had identified as a priority. The properties were real. That is the first thing I want to say clearly. The properties were real. The viewings were real. And my responses to them were real. I was not being shown photographs of houses that did not exist. I was being taken to actual structures, on actual land, in an actual beautiful part of the Philippines, and my feelings as I walked through them and looked at the sea from their gardens and felt the particular quality of the light in the late afternoon were not manufactured by anyone. Those feelings were mine. The property I responded to most strongly was a 3-bedroom house on a hillside above a small bay in Batangas. It was in poor cosmetic condition, exactly the kind of thing I had told Rochelle I could see past, but the structure was sound and the setting was extraordinary. From the upper floor you could see the bay clearly, the water a shade of blue I had been looking at in my Paradise folder for 3 years and had half believed was photographic enhancement. It was not enhanced. That was what the water actually looked like. I stood at that window for a long time and Rochelle stood behind me and said nothing, which was the right thing to do, because a good estate agent knows when silence is more effective than speech. The asking price was £145,000. She explained that for a foreign national, the most common ownership structure involved a long-term lease rather than freehold title, with a renewable 50-year term that could be structured to include a right of first refusal on purchase if the law changed. She said the process involved several stages of due diligence, and that she would manage all of it: title verification, lease negotiation, local government permits, connection to a reliable local attorney to handle the conveyancing. She said the total cost, including all fees, her professional commission, and the initial lease payment, would be approximately £175,000. She said this was the most common structure for her foreign clients and that 2 of the 3 British buyers she had assisted had used it successfully. I did not transfer any money that week. I went back to Manila and spent 5 days thinking about it, which is the pace at which I have always made large decisions. I looked up the ownership structure she had described and found it was a legitimate framework. The 50-year lease with renewal right was a real mechanism that foreigners used. I looked at the property listing she sent me and compared it to comparable listings in the area. The price was consistent with the market. I asked her for the references she had mentioned in her initial contact, and she provided 2 names with email addresses. I contacted both. Both replied with positive accounts of their experience working with Rochelle on property searches in the Philippines, though one said his purchase had not yet completed, and the other said hers had completed 18 months earlier. I noted both responses and moved on. What I did not do, and I want to be precise about this because the precision is where the lesson lives, is ask Rochelle for the name of the attorney handling the conveyancing and contact that attorney independently. I did not ask to see the title documents for the Batangas property before transferring any money. I did not engage my own independent solicitor in the Philippines to verify the ownership chain before committing funds. I have spent a great deal of time with these 3 omissions since. All 3 are standard practice in any property transaction. All 3 are things I had demanded of my own clients when I was practicing in the context of construction contracts and planning permissions. I demanded verification as a professional norm and set it aside as a private buyer because the verification would have introduced delay and friction into a situation I had decided I wanted to move forward. I transferred £87,000 to an account Rochelle specified in February. She described this as the initial lease deposit, the due diligence fee, and her professional commission for the first stage of the transaction. The account was in the name of the estate agency she worked for, Fernandez Property Solutions, which I had looked up and found had a website and a registered address in Quezon City. After the transfer, she sent me a signed acknowledgement receipt on company letterhead and a timeline of the next steps in the process. Everything appeared on its surface, to be proceeding normally. Over the following 3 months, the process moved, or appeared to move. Rochelle sent updates, a title verification report that identified a minor encumbrance being resolved, a communication from the local government unit regarding a permits application, a draft lease agreement that she said was being reviewed by the attorney. The language was professional. The documents looked real. I responded to each update with questions and she answered them. In April, she said the title issue had been resolved and that the next payment was required to proceed to the lease execution stage. The amount was £45,000. I transferred it. My friend Jeffrey called me in March. We had stayed close after the partnership ended and he called regularly, partly because he is that kind of friend and partly because his wife Anna had worried about me doing this alone and had instructed him to check in. He asked how the property search was going. I told him about the Batangas house and about Rochelle and about the transaction in progress. He asked how much I had transferred. I told him £87,000 at that point. He was quiet for a moment and then said, "Orlando, please tell me you've had someone independent verify the title." I told him Rochelle's firm had handled the verification. He said, "That's not independent. That's the person selling it to you, telling you it's fine. You need your own solicitor." I said I was comfortable with the process. He said, "You're an architect. You would never let a client accept a structural survey done by the contractor building the thing. This is the same principle." He was right. He was exactly right in exactly the way that I needed to hear it, and I set it aside because setting it aside was easier than acting on it. I'm not going to excuse that choice by saying I was dazzled by the property or the location or the dream I had been building for 3 years. Those things were part of it, but they were not the whole of it. The whole of it was that acting on Jeffrey's advice would have required me to insert a pause into a process that was moving and that I wanted to keep moving, and inserting a pause would have meant admitting, at least to myself, that there were things I had not verified that I should have, and I was not in a state of mind that made that admission comfortable. I had waited a long time for this. I had planned for it carefully. I had a folder called Paradise. The idea that something might not be right was not something I was prepared to sit with at that moment. The second property entered the picture in May. Rochelle introduced it as something that had just come to market, a smaller property in Palawan, an island I had on my list from the beginning, priced at £95,000. She said it was not being listed publicly yet, that she had a relationship with the seller, and that it was the kind of opportunity that required a quick decision. She did not push aggressively. She simply said it was available and let me sit with that information. I asked her to send me the details, and she did. Photographs, a location description, a summary of the ownership structure, a draft timeline for the transaction. The photographs were beautiful in the way that photographs of Palawan always are. I told myself I could buy both and that the Palawan property could be rented out when I was not there to generate income. I transferred £58,000 for the Palawan property in May, described as the initial payment and her commission for the second transaction, and a further £30,000 in June when she said the lease. Registration for Batangas had reached its final stage and required a government filing fee and attorney costs. By June, my total transfers to Fernandez Property Solutions stood at £220,000. In July, Rochelle stopped responding to messages the same day. The first delay was 1 day, which I attributed to business. The second was 3 days, which I attributed to a family matter she had mentioned in passing. The third was a week, after which I sent a message asking for an urgent update on both transactions. She replied with a brief note saying there had been unexpected complications with both title processes and that she would have a full update for me by the end of the following week. The following week came. There was no update. I called her phone. It rang and went to voicemail. I left a message. I sent another message. I waited 4 days. Nothing. I hired a taxi and drove to the address listed for Fernandez Property Solutions in Quezon City. The address was a shared office building of the kind that provides registered addresses for businesses that do not have physical offices. The building manager confirmed that Fernandez Property Solutions had rented a mailbox address but had never occupied physical space in the building. The company had let its arrangement lapse 2 months earlier. I stood in the lobby of that building for a moment and then went back to the street and thought about what I needed to do next in the specific, clear-headed way that I think about things when there is nothing else available to do except think clearly. I engaged a Manila attorney named Curated through a referral from the British Embassy's consular assistance list independently, with no connection to anyone Rochelle had introduced me to. Curated is a property law specialist, and she reviewed everything I gave her: the transfer records, the acknowledgement receipts, the draft lease agreements, the title verification report, the company registration details, all of it. She came back to me within 10 days. Fernandez Property Solutions was a registered company. The registration was real, but it had been incorporated 11 months before Rochelle approached me and showed no record of any completed property transactions. The title verification report for the Batangas property was a document she had not seen before, but that referenced a title number that, when she checked the registry, belonged to a property in a different province altogether. The Batangas property I had stood in and loved was real, but was not owned by the seller Rochelle had described and was not subject to any lease negotiation involving my money. The Palawan property details Rochelle had sent me matched a property that was listed publicly on 2 different websites, had nothing to do with Fernandez Property Solutions, and had not been available for months. Every piece of documentation Rochelle had provided, every receipt, every draft lease, every title report had been produced to simulate a transaction that was not occurring. The money I had transferred had gone to a business account in the name of a company that existed only as a registration number in a mailbox. Curated told me the Philippine National Police had received similar complaints about property fraud targeting foreign retirees in the preceding 2 years, and that my situation matched a pattern they were aware of. She filed a complaint on my behalf and arranged for my account of the transactions to be included in the ongoing investigation. She was honest with me about recovery. "Mr. Hemmings, I will tell you clearly what the realistic expectation is. The money has been moved. These operations typically move funds through multiple accounts quickly. Recovery of the full amount is very unlikely. Partial recovery is possible if assets can be identified. I want you to know that before you spend more pursuing it." I called Jeffrey from my hotel room that evening. He answered, and I told him the whole thing, from the beginning. He listened without interrupting, which is not his natural inclination, and when I finished he said, "Orlando, just my name." I said I knew. He said, "Anna's going to want to come out." I said that was not necessary. He said, "She's going to want to come out." They flew to Manila 3 weeks later. Anna spent the first 2 days feeding me, and the 3rd day helping me make a list of what needed to happen. Legal process, financial review, decisions about whether to remain in the Philippines or return to Bristol. The list was her idea, and it was the most useful thing anyone did for me in that period, because it gave the situation edges, and edges make things manageable in a way that formlessness does not. I am an architect. I understand the value of structure. I stayed in the Philippines for another 4 months after discovering the fraud. This surprises people when I tell them, and I can explain it. Leaving immediately would have felt like a retreat from something that was not the Philippines' fault. The country had not deceived me. A person had. The beaches I had spent 3 years looking at in photographs were still there and were still what they appeared to be. And I had already spent enough of my retirement life looking at photographs of things I intended one day to see. So I stayed, and I went to Palawan, and the water there was the color in my paradise folder, and I sat on a beach in the late afternoon light and felt grief and anger, and underneath both of those, a quiet persistence that surprised me. The dream had not been wrong. The instrument I had used to pursue it had been wrong. That is a distinction that matters. I have been back in Bristol for 8 months. The Clifton flat is smaller than the houses I was looking at in Batangas, but it is mine and it is paid for, and it has the virtue of being exactly what it appears to be, which I value more than I used to. Jeffrey and I have lunch every few weeks. Curated continues to manage the legal process in the Philippines, which has produced one positive development. The Philippine authorities identified a bank account associated with Rochelle Fernandez's real name, which is not the name she used with me, and have frozen assets pending the investigation. The amount frozen is a fraction of what I transferred, and I have no expectation of receiving the majority of it, but the process continuing means something to me. Not justice. I am old enough to know that justice is rarely the outcome of these situations. Something more like acknowledgement, the record existing, the thing being named. What I have thought about most is the folder. Not whether to delete it, but what it actually was. I built it as a project file for my retirement, and that is what it was, a genuine piece of work, produced by a genuine person, representing a genuine ambition. Rochelle did not invent the ambition. She found it and aimed at it. The fault in what happened was not the dream itself. The dream was reasonable and real and achievable. The fault was the specific shortcuts I took in pursuing it, the references I accepted at face value, the attorney I should have engaged independently and did not, the structural survey principle that Jeffrey correctly identified and that I correctly understood and incorrectly set aside. Those shortcuts were mine. They had nothing to do with the Paradise folder and everything to do with the state I was in when the process started moving in a direction I wanted it to move. I want to say something specific to anyone who is where I was in January of 2021, with a folder of research and a plan, and the particular excitement of a dream that is finally close enough to feel real. The excitement is not the problem. The plan is not the problem. The research is not the problem. The problem is what happens when the excitement of a thing being real becomes more important than verifying that it is real. At that moment, the moment when you can feel the watercolor and the afternoon light and the shape of the life you have been designing, that is precisely the moment to stop and call an independent solicitor and have them look at every document before any money moves. Not because you should distrust the person you are working with, because you should trust the process enough to want it verified. Because a property transaction that cannot survive independent scrutiny is not a property transaction. It is a performance of one. And the difference between those two things is the difference between a life built in a place you love and £220,000 gone to someone who understood that love is an opening if you know where to press it. I know that now, in the way you know things that have cost you something, not as an idea, as a scar. The folder is still there. I have not added anything to it in 8 months, and I have not deleted it. I am not done with the dream. I am done with the version of myself who pursued it carelessly. When those two things have separated cleanly enough, I will start again. More slowly, more carefully, with my own solicitor in place before anyone else is allowed near the money. That is what I owe the 3 years I spent building it.